Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Literature. Today we're going to be concentrating on giving you the information you need and the framework you need in order to apply context to the literature essay questions, focusing specifically today on an Inspector Goole. This session is to complement your lessons with your teacher and not to replace them in any way. So an Inspector Goole was written in 1946 but set in 1912. In the intervening years, the world had seen 2 world wars. Priestley fought in the First World War, and he was massively affected by what he saw during that. The idea being at the end of the First World War that the world had seen enough trauma and destruction and death, and therefore it could never happen again. It was known as the war to end all wars. However, in 1939, World War II starts. And Priestley at this point is no longer a fighting age. He is now working in radio, and he is actively critical of the war. In 1946, we have the first performance of an Inspector Goole. And that play is set in 1912. So we are 2 years before the war, but war is definitely brewing. We are also at a time when the class structure was incredibly pronounced. Now, by class structure, we are talking about the top end, people who have titles, people who own land, people who are incredibly rich. You then have a sort of middle class, so we're talking about factory owners, people who have money and therefore have some form of privilege. And then here you have the working class, the majority of the population, people who are not in any way protected or supported, people who have no access to particularly high levels of education, particularly high levels of medicine, doctors, people who have no rights essentially. And very much we have this group of people being taken advantage of, firstly by these and then by these. Okay, these people who are paid very little money in order to make money for these people. Lots of these people with no ability to vote, no ability to change what's happening to them, no ability to have an actual say in their lives, living essentially in poverty. And Priestley sets the play in 1912, even though it's written in 1946, because largely he has not seen a change. He's witnessed the working class being sent out during the war for cannon fodder. He's witnessed the most horrific violence and destruction, and men coming back from war with nothing to go to. This idea that in this section the world should change so that these things can never happen again, so that nobody is ever in that position again. And yet Priestley suggests that nothing has changed, that we are not learning our lessons, that the structure of society is still the same, even though it's slightly more blurred, and therefore we're going to be in the same position again. Now, a lot of this comes from Priestley's political views. So if we think about the fact that Britain sits here, Priestley wants this. Okay, he believes in socialism. He believes that people should look after the most vulnerable people in society, whereas this ideal believes in looking after yourself. Now, if you look at this, socialism is incredibly close to communism, and that was people's fear. And so lots of people who talked about socialist ideas were ignored. They were seen as trying to promote communism, and the majority of the world was scared of communism. Here you have the rich getting richer and the poor being oppressed because they have no way to climb out of where they are. Priestley very much spoke openly against this, spoke openly about his belief that we should look after the most vulnerable in society. So we should have benefits, we should have a free medical system, we should have all of these things that can help everyone, we should have better education. And in amongst that, you have this idea of social responsibility. Okay, so we have one person against the many. And what we need to do is look at how we can apply this to an Inspector Goole. So in the play we have the Birling family who sit very firmly here and sit very firmly here. They are people who want to maintain their control of society, who want to maintain their superiority. And so any idea this way is negative for the Birlings. This is the Birling family, the idea of self, the idea of not worrying about other people, and Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling are most firmly the embodiment of this. Mr. and Mrs. Birling embody that capitalism, that idea of money, that idea of wealth as the most important thing. And it is because of this that Priestley shows them as stupid. Priestley shows them as not as clever as the inspector, because the inspector is the embodiment of Priestley's ideas about socialism. And throughout the play, you can see that the inspector, as the embodiment of socialism, often proves the Birlings wrong. And so the reason Priestley is doing this is to show that his idea of socialism is the right idea. If the inspector is always right, socialism is always right. If the Birlings are always wrong, conservatism and capitalism are always wrong. And so when we talk about this in terms of the play, we're going to talk about the inspector as the embodiment of socialist ideas, or Priestley's ideas. When we talk about capitalism, conservatism, we're going to talk about the Birlings representing what is wrong in society. And when we talk about Eva Smith, she is the embodiment of workers. And what we see over the course of the play is that both Sheila and Eric, having sat comfortably here and having sat comfortably here, begin to change, and they begin to see that point of view. And therefore, when we talk about the change in Sheila and Eric, we are talking about the fact that Priestley is suggesting that the younger generation can change. So we're never just going to randomly talk about the fact that Priestley is a socialist. We're going to talk about how that applies to the play, how we see it in the play, and how it affects the action of the play. So what you need to do now is think about what Priestley is suggesting about the world by setting the play in 1912 and explain how this relates to his beliefs and world events. If you look at what we talked about here, this idea that nothing has changed, and what Priestley is suggesting might happen if we don't make a change.